He ate a pork chop at a family barbecue. 6 weeks later, doctors found worms living inside his muscles. Not one worm, not 10, hundreds. Some were wrapped around muscle fibers in his legs. Others were buried in the muscles that moved his eyes. A few had settled into the muscles between his ribs, turning every breath into pain. And here is the part that should keep you awake tonight. The pork chop had come from a local grocery store. The family had cooked it themselves. Nobody at that barbecue thought they were taking a risk, because the danger wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Welcome to system failure. This story is based on documented medical cases and known outbreaks of trichinellosis. In the summer of 2018, a family gathered outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for a 4th of July barbecue. There were 14 people in attendance: parents, grandparents, teenagers, a few cousins home from college. The kind of gathering that happens every year and feels exactly the same every time. The grill was loaded with burgers, hot dogs, and pork chops. The pork chops belonged to Daniel Mercer. He was 34 years old, a construction supervisor, married, with 2 children, the kind of man who spent his weekdays managing job sites and his weekends fixing things that weren't broken. He had bought the pork from a local farm stand outside town. The farmer advertised it as organic, pasture-raised, and antibiotic-free. Daniel liked supporting local businesses. His wife liked knowing where their food came from. Everybody felt good about the purchase. The chops looked beautiful, thick, fresh, marbled. The kind of meat people take pictures of before grilling. There was only one problem: nobody used a thermometer. The chops came off the grill when they looked done. And looking done is not the same thing as being done. Remember that, because that detail is the entire story. The barbecue ended around sunset. Everyone went home full. Nobody felt sick. Nobody had any reason to think they should. 3 days later, Daniel woke up with stomach cramps. Nothing severe, just enough to be annoying. He blamed the barbecue. Too much food, too much beer, too much dessert. By lunchtime, diarrhea started. His wife had similar symptoms. So did his cousin. It looked exactly like food poisoning, because at first, it was. The symptoms lasted 3 days. Then they disappeared. The family moved on. Nobody called a doctor. Nobody remembered the pork chops. And meanwhile, inside Daniel's body, something had begun. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the parasite. Trichinella spiralis, a worm so small you could fit dozens on your fingernail. A parasite that spent thousands of years hiding in pork long before modern food inspection existed. For generations, it was one of the most feared foodborne diseases in America. Then farming practices improved. Commercial infections dropped. Most doctors stopped seeing cases. Most people stopped worrying about it. The parasite never disappeared. It just became rare enough that everyone forgot. Daniel swallowed microscopic larvae hidden inside undercooked pork. His stomach acid dissolved the protective capsules. The larvae emerged alive. Within hours, they invaded the wall of his intestine. Within days, they matured into adult worms. Male worms found female worms. The females began producing newborn larvae, not eggs, live larvae. Thousands of them. Each one entered Daniel's bloodstream, and then the real infection began. The stomach symptoms improved because the worms had already moved on. Daniel thought he was recovering. He wasn't recovering. The parasite was simply changing locations. For 2 weeks, he felt normal. He went to work, coached his son's baseball team, helped his neighbor replace a fence. Nothing seemed wrong. The worms continued traveling, looking for muscle. Not random muscle, specific muscle. The muscles with the richest blood supply. Eyes, jaw, neck, shoulders, chest, legs. One by one, the larvae penetrated individual muscle fibers, and once they got inside, they did something horrifying. They transformed the muscle cell itself. A healthy muscle fiber stopped being a muscle fiber. The parasite reprogrammed it, turned it into what scientists call a nurse cell, a living shelter built from Daniel's own tissue. The worm wasn't hiding in his body. It was remodeling his body to keep itself alive. 6 weeks after the barbecue, Daniel woke up with pain in both calves, the kind of soreness you get after a hard workout, except he hadn't worked out. The next day, the pain spread into his thighs. By the weekend, his shoulders hurt too. Then came the fever, 102 degrees Fahrenheit, then 103 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife told him to see a doctor. The urgent care physician suspected influenza. It was summer. The flu test came back negative. The doctor prescribed rest and fluids. Daniel went home. 2 days later, his face started swelling. His eyelids puffed outward. The skin around his eyes tightened. Coworkers immediately noticed. "You look exhausted. You okay? Did you get stung by something?" Daniel laughed it off. By that evening, chewing hurt, talking hurt, moving his eyes hurt. Every muscle in his body felt bruised. The next morning, he could barely climb stairs. He returned to urgent care. Blood work revealed elevated muscle enzymes. Very elevated. The doctor grew concerned. When muscles break down, they release an enzyme called creatine kinase. Daniel's levels were nearly 10 times normal. The physician suspected an autoimmune disease, possibly polymyositis, his immune system attacking his own muscles. It fit the symptoms: muscle pain, weakness, inflammation, fever, facial swelling. The diagnosis seemed reasonable. It was wrong. Daniel was referred to a specialist. The rheumatologist ordered additional testing, more blood work, more scans, more waiting. Meanwhile, the worms continued building nurse cells inside his muscles. Each larva curled into a spiral. Each spiral became enclosed inside a collagen capsule. Each capsule developed its own microscopic blood supply. The worms weren't merely surviving. They were feeding, growing, living inside Daniel's body. The rheumatologist called 3 days later. Another abnormality had appeared. Daniel's eosinophil count was extremely elevated. Eosinophils are immune cells commonly associated with parasites, but they're also associated with allergies, certain cancers, autoimmune conditions. The result created confusion instead of clarity. One doctor suspected leukemia. Another suggested a rare inflammatory disorder. Nobody mentioned worms, because almost nobody sees trichinellosis anymore. Daniel spent the next week bouncing between specialists. His symptoms worsened. The pain spread into his chest. Breathing became uncomfortable, not because his lungs were infected, because the muscles between his ribs were full of larvae. Every breath stretched inflamed muscle tissue. Every cough felt like being punched. By the 7th week after the barbecue, Daniel was admitted to the hospital. Doctors still didn't know why. His wife sat beside his bed, scrolling through medical forums. Cancer, autoimmune disease, blood disorders. The possibilities became darker with every search. And then one infectious disease specialist walked into the room. He reviewed the chart: fever, muscle pain, facial swelling, elevated eosinophils, elevated muscle enzymes. He paused, then asked a question nobody else had asked. "What have you eaten recently?" Daniel looked confused. "Nothing unusual." The doctor waited. Daniel thought for a moment, then remembered. The family barbecue. What was served? Burgers, hot dogs, pork chops. The doctor stopped writing. How cooked were the pork chops? Daniel suddenly remembered something. Some had been slightly pink. Not raw, just a little underdone. The infectious disease specialist nodded slowly. For the first time since Daniel entered the hospital, somebody knew where to look. The blood test for Trichinella was ordered immediately. But here's the problem. The test wasn't guaranteed to help, because the antibodies often appear late, sometimes weeks after symptoms begin. A patient can have worms throughout their muscles while the blood test still says negative. It's one of the reasons this disease is frequently missed. The worms arrive before the evidence does. The results took several days. Meanwhile, doctors began treatment based on suspicion alone. Albendazole, an anti-parasitic medication, combined with corticosteroids to control inflammation. Because another terrible thing was happening. Daniel wasn't only suffering from the worms, he was suffering from his immune system finally discovering them. When larvae enter muscle, the body eventually recognizes the invasion. The resulting inflammation causes much of the pain, the swelling, the weakness, the fever. In a strange way, the parasite hurts you twice, first by invading, then by triggering your body's response. 3 days later, the test returned. Positive. Daniel had trichinellosis. The diagnosis finally fit everything. The stomach illness, the delayed symptoms, the facial swelling, the muscle destruction, the elevated eosinophils. The mystery was solved. But solving it didn't immediately make him better. By that point, many larvae were already sealed inside nurse cells, protected, embedded. Some anti-parasitic drugs work best before the worms reach that stage. The delay mattered, and delays are exactly what this parasite relies on. Most infections don't announce themselves dramatically. They whisper, they let time pass, they let doctors look elsewhere. Daniel remained hospitalized for another week. The fevers gradually improved, the swelling slowly decreased, the pain began to ease. Eventually, he was discharged, but recovery wasn't immediate. For months afterward, he experienced fatigue, muscle soreness, occasional weakness. Some patients recover completely. Others carry lingering symptoms long after the worms die, because the capsules can remain inside tissue for years. Dead, calcified, silent reminders of an infection that should never have happened. Investigators later examined the source of the pork. The farm wasn't violating regulations. The animals weren't intentionally raised unsafely. But unlike large commercial facilities, smaller operations can create gaps. And rare diseases exploit gaps. That's what makes stories like this so unsettling. Nobody behaved recklessly. Nobody was eating exotic food in a remote jungle. Nobody ignored obvious danger. A man bought pork, grilled it, fed it to his family, and 6 weeks later, worms were living inside his muscles. That's the part people struggle with, because it doesn't feel like a risky decision. It feels like an ordinary one, and ordinary decisions create the most terrifying stories, not because they're common, because they're relatable. Daniel eventually returned to work, returned to coaching baseball, returned to normal life, mostly. But he became obsessive about one thing: food thermometers. Friends joked about it. Family members rolled their eyes. Every barbecue, every holiday, every cookout, same ritual. Check the temperature, check it again, then check it one more time. Because once you've spent weeks wondering whether you have cancer, a blood disorder, or an autoimmune disease before discovering the real answer was worms living inside your muscles, you stop trusting appearances. The pork chop looked done. That was the problem. It looked done. It wasn't. And here's what I need you to remember. Trichinellosis is rare. Extremely rare compared with a century ago, but rarity creates its own danger. The rarer a disease becomes, the less likely doctors are to think of it. The less likely patients are to recognize it. The easier it becomes to miss. A fever, muscle pain, facial swelling, weeks after eating undercooked pork or wild game. Most people won't think parasite. Many physicians won't either, until somebody asks the right question. What did you eat? Daniel Mercer ate a pork chop at a family barbecue. The meal lasted 20 minutes. The infection lasted months. The worm stayed longer. This is system failure. I'll see you in the next waiting room.